Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning on this webinar. So today we're going to be hearing from Stephen Sanger, who's the Operations Manager at Birmingham Mind, where we're going to be talking about Peer Mentors scheme that Steve's been working on for some time. Oh, I seem to have already changed the slide. So let me just take that back to the first slide. I am, without further ado, going to mute myself and hand over to Steve so that we can get on with hearing about the work that's been going on. Steve, can we just check that you're still with us and the sound is working?
I am. I'm with you. Sound's working.
Lovely. Right, I shall turn myself to mute now.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. As explained, I'm Steve Sanger. I'm the Operations Manager. Up in the top left-hand corner of the slides, you'll see that I work for Birmingham Mind. Let me just explain how Birmingham Mind works with Central Mind. I don't want people to be confused between how the organisations fit together. So minds throughout the country, and we're Birmingham Mind, they affiliate to Central Mind if they do so wish, and on that affiliation they get certain benefits. And so we've got our own staff team, our own managers, our own finance. We're as a separate organisation, but we actually affiliate to Central Mind. So I'm going to talk today about some research we did into one of our programs, our services, where we have what we call experts by experience, but for want of a better word, they are sort of like peer mentors. We had some of those individuals move off to paid employment externally to the program, and I just want to talk through the research we did with those people and the learning, and then how we took that learning and brought it into our own peer mentor scheme. So let me just talk a little bit about Birmingham Mind before I move on. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just trying. I seem to be having a slight problem in changing the slides. Let me see if I can.
So, while we're waiting for that, let me just explain that we run a number of services. We're about a £6.5 million turnover organisation. There we go. Thank you very much. We've got a circa around about 200 staff. We're 55 years old. We obviously employ local people who are supporting local people. We've got residential care homes up at the top there. We've got some home support for people with mental health. So we're a mental health organisation primarily. That serve user involvement projects over on the right hand side. We'll be talking a little bit about that. That's where some of our work has been. We've got supported housing as a service. The volunteering element again comes in with some service user projects, which I'll talk about a bit later. We've got some recovery services which are focused around how we maintain people in recovery, and some of the interventions we've got some recovery in our recovery services. We've got some interventions that we do. Some of those are training, some of those are activities. We work with schools to try and do some prevention work. We've got some training and work-based support for both people in work, for organisations, and those people who need to return to work. We've got some floating support services around maintaining people with mental health in their accommodation to avoid homelessness, and we've got some wellbeing hub services. The wellbeing hub is a contracted service which GPs refer patients into, and there's a dedicated line that people ring, and we staff that line and talk to people about whatever issues around their mental health they need to talk about, and what support they need, and how we might navigate those people or support them in more detail. Okay, so that's Birmingham Mind. I'm going to start to talk about, next page please, we're going to talk about how some people experienced getting employment. So primarily, and next page please, we're going to look at a project, a program called Every Step of the Way, which is part of a Changing Futures Together program. And that program is actually taking people with historical complex needs and bringing those people into a service which actually allows those people to talk about their histories and their experiences of complex needs in front of commissioners and service providers. They get involved in a range of activities that enable them to bring about service change in Birmingham for complex needs structures and pathways and services. And so from that service, we had a number of people who we call experts by experience. They're sort of unpaid peer mentors, really. We've had 42 people leave when the research happened. Actually, we've had about 60 people leave to date. 4 of those people have gone into further education. 10 people were employed. 7 people went into volunteering. In actual fact, 16 people have gone into employment now. And remembering these people, when I talk about complex needs, I'm really talking about homelessness, experience of addiction services, so experience of addiction, so that could be alcohol or drugs. We're talking about offending histories, and we're talking about mental health, which is obviously why we've been involved. So people with a range of complex needs are in this service, and some of them have moved off to unemployment. We followed those people just as they were going to employment and when they went into employment, and so I'm just going to talk about on the next slide what's come out of that. So we did some research and we followed these people. We interviewed all the 10 who were at various stages of unemployment. Some people were still employed. Most of these people were employed from 6 months to a year. Some people were unemployed, having been employed, so had sort of fallen through the net, or that employment had failed in some sort of way. Equally, some people had been employed, unemployed, and were now ready for employment again, so ready to move back in. And some people had taken a self-employed route, self-employed but working for another organisation as self-employed, not self-employed running their own business. 85% reported that the expert programme, which is every step of the way, had had a positive effect on finding them employment. Talk about that a bit later. And 65% of those employed who were in the programme were actually in a positions where their expertness and their previous experiences were now becoming a positive and not a negative in terms of their view of their histories. Next page, please. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about moving from a volunteering, so unpaid sort of experts by experience, into employment. There's a range of employment. Some of those people moved into the third sector. Some of those people went to forklift driving, worked in factories. So a range of employments, I suppose. The transition from volunteering to employment was discussed in great detail. A lack of self-assurance for individuals that were going through that transition. A lot of anxiety around performance. So in that transition, you know, what were they expected to achieve? A lot of anxiety around that at the start. A lot of anxiety around them being able to sustain that employment. And some nervousness for some people around the employment process itself. So getting forms filled out correctly. These days of using IT more to fill forms out. Some people not within that skill window. Competing with others, so knowing other people were applying for jobs that they knew and competing against those other people. And a sort of real nervousness around some of their history disclosure. So some of these people having offending history, some of these people having a mental health forensic history. So a lot of nervousness about what to disclose, how that disclosure might be seen, and the barriers that throws up to people feeling that they can't apply. Those who had worked before had significantly less anxiety around some of those latter issues. So some of the form filling, some of the competition, some of the disclosure issues for people that had worked before were less. They were less anxious. They knew where to go for support, and they had previous knowledge and skills around such areas as the form filling and interviews. Next slide, please. So when they're in employment now, so people, this is people as they're beginning to do that transition bit on the last slide. These are people that are talking now about their early days of employment. So building relationships was not easy. A lot of people talked about relationship building as being seen to be, they felt different in their workplace. Some of these people, remember, had not worked before. Some of these people had changed the culture of their employment, so had moved from private to private employment to third sector employment. So a little bit different relationships at work. So the difference between, you know, who's a peer and who's a peer but works in a different team but on the same grade. Who is their line manager, but what are all these other managers and what do they do? And what relationship do we have with them? Are they allowed to talk to them? Are they not? Lots of what you would think obvious answers to those questions. But I suppose it begins to show you the level of detail that people need that are making that transition. There was a lack of commonality, so a feeling out of place, a feeling like they weren't the typical person at work, and that was, I suppose, more internalised rather than externalised. And when we talk about office banter, let me give you an example. So we had a guy who was in his late 40s who had spent 20 years in prison on a lot of different offences, so in and out of prison, but spent 20 of his 40 odd years in prison. He sat down one day at work, and the office were talking, the people in the office were talking about where they'd been on holiday last year and where they might be going this year. He didn't feel he could really contribute to that conversation, given that he'd never been on holiday. And therefore, situations where people felt they couldn't contribute because they hadn't worked in environments and hadn't had experience that other people had had who'd got money, who'd had different lifestyles, made them feel different. The argument is, I suppose, should experts by experience, should people go into employment be honest about themselves and share different experiences for people to explore? Our people certainly felt that they needed to fit in rather than people fit around them. And there's a debate there, I suppose. One of the statements, so you need to have a bit about you to get on. The organisation did not make it easy, was a statement by one of the people going into employment. And there's this age versus experience clash, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But we certainly experienced this notion that employers or peers look at someone who's in their 40s, and actually if it's their first job, their age first experience clash is sort of doesn't equate. So when a 40-year-old asks you, I don't know, how does this work, how does that policy work, and asks you very simple questions, begins to expose their lack of experience. But people wouldn't know that from looking at them. They wouldn't know that they didn't have a previous work history. There's this notion that people coming through complex needs into employment needed an induction before induction. So this notion that are people with complex needs when they start, if they're judged over a 6-month period, so a probationary period the same as other people, will they actually make it to the finishing line, or do they need 9 months? That's certainly an internal debate for us when we brought the peer mentoring program in. People had limited business or experience, work experience, literacy skills, and struggled with all of those. There were some self-esteem issues early on for some people, and some people didn't get past that. there was a perceived lack of support from the organisation, which leads into this feeling that the organisation had a lack of understanding of complex histories and backgrounds. But is that reasonable given the jobs they were moving into? And should employers have to bridge that gap, or is it for the employee to bridge that gap and get over it? So a lot of stuff early on. Thank you for changing that. A lot of stuff early on. What did employers feel? So employers who were supervising those people in transition echoed those sentiments, observed that low self-esteem gets in the way of productivity. And there's that cycle, if we're not careful, where we try and address the productivity issue, which therefore affects self-esteem and therefore affects productivity. And we're in that cycle of negative cycle, where the person feels less able to achieve ongoing. And how do we break that cycle? That's certainly a conversation the employers had. And this notion that policies and procedures need to be in place or adjusted. So let me give you an example. Social media policy. If we think that some of these people are coming through a complex needs history background, then some of their friends and some of their acquaintances are people who are still in those environments. So let's take addiction. Let's say that one of these, well, it definitely was one of the people, one of the individuals was still going to NA groups, so Narcotics Anonymous groups, to part of their recovery, still bumping into some of their acquaintances or friends, as they would call them, on Facebook with some of those people, and therefore, you know, the danger that they have got people, and if they're in the third sector, then you can see that relationships sometimes are difficult. You've got a recovery person in recovery that needs support from their wider circle of friends, but some of their friends are in services that they might be working in some of those services or in adjoined services. So it was a little bit difficult to look at policies and procedures and see if they fitted for some of those people coming in. Some of the examples of experts about where employers had helped were that there was a lot of proactive support, so that sort of softer management where people are asking them if they're okay and looking at them and checking on them and all of that. Nice examples of how we manage people outside of a formal structure. That helped. Where managers were finding that educational courses or training was appropriate and sending them on, that was very well done. People offering support around the culture of work, and so people adjusting to the cultural work with support was important for them. They found this notion of an open door support that they talked about, so managers being approachable, they found that a bit weird and a bit strange, but very supportive. And there's confidence enough, I suppose, those confident enough to get to ask for more support for those people that maybe worked before. There was definitely a debate about confidence and self-esteem and how to deal with those issues with employers talked about. And this interesting dilemma which employers talked about trying to treat all the staff with some consistency, but bringing in a range of support that treated those people that needed further support around complex needs differently. So quite an interesting debate. One thing to try and avoid, really, we had two of the experts by experience who moved off to employment. They went on secondment, so they worked for one organisation who seconded them out to another, and that spectacularly failed. Partly because of the lack of belonging to either of those organisations, and when you're trying to deal with all of the stuff I've just talked about, and then you bring in a sort of lack of would they really belong to, the person that they're seconded to or the person that's paying them, trying to understand those two different cultures sometimes, which policies do they follow, who's going to resolve my problems. So really just a plea really for peer mentors and secondments. or first time employment for people. Sending them out to comment really didn't work for us, and we're trying to avoid any of those things in future. Next slide, please. One of the big issues came about when we talked about benefits and salaries. So moving from benefits and picking up a salary. So where's the finance guidance and assistance that needed to feature heavily here? They sort of felt a little bit alone. So some of the quotes were, it is difficult to sign back on, and to give that up is hard. The benefit trap is a massive pull. So this notion of the first hurdle really that stops even people applying for roles, because if they don't understand that they've got some continuation of employment, or that move from benefits to salary is too big and there's too many unanswered questions, then that stops people moving forward. Another quote was, financial issues made me anxious. I can't go back to signing on now. So people feeling sort of a little bit trapped, having made the decision to move over, then worrying because their performances may be poor, their self-esteem is dropping, and they're focused on, they can't go back to signing on now because that signing on avenue's gone. They can't leave work because they won't get benefit. If they're dismissed, they won't get a benefit. And so they're in that anxious place, I suppose. Another person who had lost their ESA, I had to move in with their parents, and found it quite stressful. Was only on a 2-year contract, and that was about, what they say, coming to an end. That was about 10 months away when they were talking to us. But you can see how the stress and the anxiety is kicking in with 10 months to go. Would it, if you had a bigger employment history, would it kick in with 10 months to go, or would it kick in with 6 months to go? I don't know, but these people certainly taking on a 2-year contract, that felt like that was good enough to get in, but halfway through we're beginning to worry about exiting. Actually, that person did find another job with about 3 months to go, and he's working for another third sector organisation now, doing well. There's a high level anxiety around relinquishing benefits and resuming benefits. Employers, they felt, were not set up to support that process, so didn't really understand how benefits would switch when they would end, weren't tying in their salaries into a window, so some people were left with sort of gaps between benefit ending and salary starting, and had no bus fare to get to work, and all of those things. And so employers weren't making the offer, even though they were very happy to accept requests. They weren't explaining they were happy to accept requests for, I suppose, salary in advance, some salary in advance. Experts in employment were feeling trapped, and the dilemma feeling supported or in a process. So in that moving through that process, is it a process of coming off benefits and moving on to salary, but feeling that they weren't supported in that process, that it was just a physical process in itself? Next slide, please. We've got about 15 minutes before we take questions, people, so have a think about those. So the learning for us in terms of when we watched these people move through to being volunteers or peer mentors into work, make sure it is a fit for both the organisation and the individual. Try before you buy, so try and give the individual a chance to see the job in its reality if you get the chance. It gives the person a better understanding of the role, and it gets rid of some of the anxieties. This notion that staff do not understand the needs of people in recovery, and that this person who was making this statement felt unsupported over a complaint or an allegation. So what happened in this instance was one of the clients who this person was supporting in their role made an allegation about them, made a complaint. That person wasn't suspended, but was actually put on office duties only until that was resolved. That took about 4 weeks, and I think as professionals we sometimes know that these things can take a while, and actually the person who's got the complaint against them, in this instance, this new person at work felt that they were just left in the dark and unattended and unsupported, and they didn't really understand what was taking so long. And so I suppose just this learning around how we manage people in those situations who have greater anxiety at that moment in time. Being an expert experience, so when they talked about their history as unpaid peer mentors, they found that some of the confidence that they gained through that program helped them well. So being involved in interview panels, being involved in mystery shopping exercises, being part of consultation exercises, taking part, being a part of something where they didn't feel unusual, so they were with other people with similar experiences, and where the focus was on their development, not just on their recovery, they felt all those things worked well. So we took some of those things, because if we're going to employ people from lived experience through to employment, we looked at how that program had developed those experiences and we took it forward, and I'll talk about those in a moment. And an awareness of how, so some learning about an awareness of how to manage those complex needs in a workplace appropriately, and to be a support to experts, being embedded and active in their own recovery networks outside of the workplace. So what I'm trying to say there is, how do we support people that are moving to employment when they've got histories of complex needs, but actually their recovery is out in the work, out in their wider life. And so the need to have a think about those. And I'll come back to that in a moment as well. So let me talk about the paid peer mentors, and a little bit of, it's called the hard truth, because I was talking to the managers in Birmingham Mind about how the peer mentoring had gone, and the good and the bad. So I'm just going to talk to you about how we took people with mental health lived experience and brought them into paid peer mentor roles within Birmingham Mind. So the recruitment, we changed the recruitment process so we could try and create that as a positive, and take away some of the negatives from that process, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Equally, we wanted to create a process that allowed people to step away from something that didn't look right. So in other words, to say to them, well, you can come along to this, it won't affect your benefits, you can leave at any point, and actually it's okay to leave at any point because we've taken away some of the anxiety. Talk about that again in a little moment, but it allows us to, we looked at a recruitment process that allowed us to impart a level of detail that informed them of what the real job is, not what the job looked on paper. So next slide, please. So we interviewed to a training program rather than to the job. So we over recruited, we needed 8 people. We actually wanted 16 people to go through the training program. Let me explain how that might work. Everybody applied as normal. There was some support over the telephone for people that were struggling with the ID part of applying, but people applied in the same way they normally would. There was just less criteria at this point to get them through the door. And remember, we're asking people here that they have to have mental health lived experience within the last 2 years. But other people could not apply. Doesn't matter about the rest of their history, but that's one of the core criteria for employment, is that lived experience. The training program we devised was over 4 weeks, and it was 5 hours, so sort of a little bit of a shorter day, but for one of those days in a week. So we didn't do 4 days altogether. We wanted to spread them out. We rang people in between those days to check how the learning had gone for them, whether they had any questions. So we did all that nice bit. So we spent about 2 hours in all with an individual over that 4-week period, just supporting them on the phone, just to make sure. We lost some people in that process along the training program, which was what we expected. So we were allowing some people to leave. and we were allowing some people to find out for themselves that it wasn't for them. So that was part of the process. Next slide, please. We looked at what does swapping formal learning for lived experience, what issues did that throw up for the staff, for us as an organisation, and for them. So in the top left-hand corner, the one that's a little bit more difficult to read because it's in blue, my apologies for that, that those applying and recruited still didn't feel or believe that their lived experience is actually counted as a positive. So even at that point of applying, still didn't believe, even though they needed it to get a job, that we were taking that as a positive. Undersold their lived experience in the recruitment process. That those applying or recruited are on a recovery journey, which only they know where they are. So we were trying to, through a process, through the recruitment process, understand where they were in their recovery journey, what was keeping them well and safe, what they still needed to do in their recovery journey, trying to get them to talk about that, but more importantly, if they're not talking about it, but think about it. Bottom left, so find the right working hours formula that's important and necessary for them. So what we did was we took a formula where we worked within the benefit system, and we thought to ourselves, we're going to get these 8 people in, and we're going to get these 8 people to determine what their own working hours would be. So they had to commit to more than 12 hours a week, but that didn't go beyond 18, because we knew if it went beyond 18 hours that they would fall outside of retaining their benefits. And this way, for a year, they could retain their benefits, still work for between 12 and 18 hours. And that would mean they wouldn't have to give up their benefits. It means that at any moment they could drop out and they'd still retain their benefits. These jobs that we're giving them last a year, and then we say to them, okay, well, we've done this for a year. We want you now to either commit to what's next for you. So that might be college, it might be university, it might be working for somebody else, or it might be an offer of a job with us, which moves to full-time hours. And how does that look like? But whilst we're in this window of them thinking about working for us, we're actually saying to them, actually, what works well for you? So what works well in terms of how many hours do you want to do, and what's the makeup of those hours? So some people chose to work on a Monday, Wednesday and a Friday and have days off in between, so they could balance themselves out. They thought that was best. Some people chose to start work at 10:30 and walk their dog in the morning, or get up later, and they thought that might work for them best. So they had a range of different ways in which we allowed them to build in their recovery, the things that kept them safe, the thing that kept them well around their working life. And again, it's sort of the wrong way round. So some of our managers thinking, hang on a minute, this is all about them and not about us. Well, in some ways it is, but in some of our services, as long as we know when people are going to work. So don't get me wrong, these people couldn't decide on a Sunday what they were going to work this coming week. They needed to sign up to a structure. And as long as we knew what that structure was and when they were coming to work, we could work around that. Next slide, please. We looked at their induction and the fact that we needed to take out most of the grey areas where we could. We needed to, and this is one of the things they said that came out of the research, that we ask people in our environment, in our culture. Some of these people come from a culture of telling them what to do. So when you say to an individual, oh, would you like to go out with Jinder today? He's going to be looking after you. Are you asking them, or are you telling them? Or would you like to read the loan working policy? Are we asking them, or are we telling them? And it's a cultural sensitivity, I suppose, where in our culture we ask. And some of our peer mentors are saying, don't ask us, just tell us what to do. That's what we expect. So a little bit of a sort of cultural shift, really. It seems strange to some people during their induction that they were getting used to this culture of asking. Expect that staff will be starting at a different point to other staff, and they may take longer to get through their induction. We talked about this earlier in the research. In actual fact, one of the things we learnt as well was you don't wait till month 4, 5 or 6 to tell somebody that you're going to extend their probationary period. We're better off, and we learned through the research, you're better off at month 3 saying to somebody, we're going to extend this by a couple of months because we're a little bit out of where we need to be, and we expected maybe that we would, because that takes away this. We had an experience in the research where somebody got to 5 months and the employer was saying, we're going to extend by a month, and then they weren't in the right place, so they extended by another month. This got into month 10 before they got through their probationary period. And if the employer had just said at the start, look, we're just going to extend by 3 months, I think that's an acceptance there that actually people are starting at a different point. If normal people starting work, and sort of normal people without complex needs, maybe without the histories of some of these individuals, have to run 100 metres to get to the 6-month probationary period and get signed off, some of these people are running 130 metres, and therefore clearly it's going to take them longer. They will ask far more questions, so some of the managers coming back internally will be going, these people pester us, they are asking loads of questions, they're always at the office door, the supervisions are taking far longer than other people. Well, okay, we sort of expect that. That's part of they're learning more, they haven't got the history of employment of other people have got. Some people that had worked before had the softer skills and the cultural learning, and some of the peer mentors didn't. And then we've got this age versus dilemma, experience dilemma, that certainly some of the managers, and actually their peers rather than their managers, experienced. So things that would find quite funny, because somebody didn't know what a word meant or what a policy was supposed to be doing. So all of that as part of the induction was worth revisiting, we thought. Next slide, please. We've got about 4 minutes left. So I'm just going to go through some of our thoughts that have been thrown up. So there's a couple of slides here about just of our learning. Every step of the way is the ESOW statement, and SP is the service, the supporting people program is the service that these people moved off into. So we've got learning through the research and learning through the 8 people that have come into employment. So be mindful that some of these people are over enthusiastic. They've got a job, they love it, they want to learn as much as possible, they put their hand up for everything, and actually sometimes it isn't good that they want to get involved in everything. They just need to be doing what they need to do. Some have been more reserved, so have asked far less. Some of them clearly learning in a different way, so they preferred to read, look and digest, all of which reflects a sort of look back and a reflection back onto the learning styles matrices that we would know as managers, but they're far more pronounced in terms of learning styles. So they probably haven't had the chance, some of these individuals, to think or experience a wider development in terms of their learning styles. So they're very fixed. So our inductions and the way in which we're teaching people to learn in a working place just need to reflect that. Some have needed more reassurance, when we talked about that earlier. They have tended to struggle with the role being new, so these are the first people in, they're year 1, they're the sort of guinea pigs, if you like, whereas other staff don't know how the role fits with the service. So their colleagues, because it's the first year, they had far more questions, even though we tried to do all that at the start. They didn't seem to know how it fit, and if these new people coming in ask their peers, how does this work? And if they don't know, they seem a bit like, what's going on? And we've lost 2 of the 8. So actually, when we recruited 12, because 4 people dropped out, and we recruited 12, so we recruited 4 people to what we called a peer mentor bank, because we knew some people, when they experienced the real job, they might step back out of it. And so we've been able to take some people off the bank into employment, and actually the other 2 people that were left in the bank, they were picked up by one of our partner agencies that wanted to employ some peer mentors. And so because these people had had the training and had their DBS and everything else, they were able to move into and work for that organisation. So that's worked really well. So over recruitment seemed a bit cruel to start with, but it's worked really, really well. Next slide before I, oh, there we are, people. I do apologise. So I've gone through the research. I've gone through how that mirrored in terms of the recruiting 8 people internally into some peer mentor posts and how that worked. Thank you for listening. For those people that want to switch off, and for those people that have got any questions, then I'm happy to deal with those now.
Wow, thank you, Steve. That's fantastic. I've been sitting here absolutely scribbling down questions. So while our participants have a think about, I'm not seeing anything on the screen yet. So please, if you do have a question, you can click on the question or the, oh gosh, sorry, I keep getting these emails flooding in. A little hand, and you click on the hand, and it kind of puts your hand up, and you can ask a question. So while we're waiting for people to do that, Steve, I've got so many questions. I think it's really fascinating hearing this very detailed research that, you know, builds from the experiences of, you know, learning for organisations, learning for staff in organisations, learning for each of those individuals who've been going through this programme. And I was just wondering about kind of external agencies, and the key one that jumps to mind for me is, where were the DWP in this process? Have they helped in terms of funding for access to work and support to people? What about Job Centre Plus and the disability employment advisors? What role have they played, if any, in this process?
Well, that's a very good question, and one of the reasons why we didn't get those services involved in the process was that actually the people themselves, so the experts by experience and the people with lived experience who came into employment, viewed those people as a negative, as if these people involved, then they're going to judge me, and they're going to be waiting for me to fail, and they might have restrictions, they might step in the way. And so actually not having statutory services involved in that process was actually, it gave less anxiety for the individuals, except it left the individuals probably, one of the learning was that when they had to go and sort out their benefits for themselves, as an organisation, we're not really set up as an organisation to to watch and help someone go through that transformation from benefits to employment.
Yeah, and you know, my experience over the years in this very area tells me that continues to be an incredibly complex area for people, and you know, you will get different responses from local offices. You know, there might be a kind of national line from DWP, but the interpretation of policy locally might be different. The first response that somebody might get if they go into Job Centre Plus and say, I'd like to talk to a disability employment advisor, they might be told, well, you're not disabled. You know, there's a whole load of kind of hurdles that people will fall at. And I think that's a real challenge here, because had people had another form of disability, I think there would have perhaps been a different approach and a different kind of practice and support, which would have perhaps enabled them to have then purchased through access to work some of the kind of additional supports that, you know, if you have a visual impairment, it might be a screen reader. When we're talking about mental health and some of the other kind of complex challenges that people have experienced here, it's not necessarily a screen reader, but it might be something like a yoga class to help you manage the stress and anxiety of being at work, or a job coach to help you kind of process some of the stuff that you've experienced during the day, whatever it might be. And I think that's probably a real gap, isn't it, about what access to work provides to people whose support needs are a bit different.
Yeah, that's very true, very true, very true.
Yeah. Did you get to develop any kind of guidance for the employers you were working with?
So I think one of the things we wanted to do first was think about it ourselves, think about our policies and procedures, think about how we are experiencing employment for these 8. So we're sort of our 8 are about 5-6 months in now.
Yeah.
And so we're sort of picking up that research so we can actually begin to think about you know, our own experience and the research, and then think about, because one of the things we'd very much like to do is support employers to be better able to support people with complex needs or mental health
Yeah.
through to
Yeah.
employment, because that's a win for us both, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I suppose I was thinking that, you know, somewhere in this, there's a top 10 tips, isn't there, for
Mm.
employers? I mean, it's probably a bit more complex than that, but you know, what would you want to tell other people who were going to go
Yeah, it's a
down a
good
similar
idea.
kind of approach, really?
Yeah, it's a good idea. Well, you got to remember, I suppose, that some of the people that came through the training, and some of the people that we, in terms of the research we did, when you come from complex histories, they have a way of which they've survived either on the street or in it with addiction, which
Yes.
can be quite manipulative. And
Mm.
actually, that's quite difficult for employers to deal with,
Yeah.
because our people
Yeah.
can be very good at twisting the rules a little bit
Because
in
that's
their
been part of
advantage.
survival. Yeah.
It has, and we've got to do,
Yeah.
we've got to try and train people to not use those and use formal structure.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, no, I can understand that. How have you gone on with occupational health structures?
So we've got those internally, so it's been quite easy for us when we've been employing ours
Yeah.
to fit it into the normal HR way in which we would sit down with an individual. When we employ people, they've got a very simple questionnaire that happens, and then because we're a mental health focused organisation, we're focused both on their mental health and their physical need. So in terms of that, and then we've really had to focus on our EAP scheme. So we lots of employers have an employment assistance program
Yes.
that
Yes,
where
that's what I
people
was
can
thinking. Yeah.
independent.
Yeah.
We've actually worked with those people to say we've got this new
Yes.
set of people, and actually we anticipate they might use you more than our other staff. So
Yeah.
we're monitoring that at the moment. They're monitoring it for us because we don't get the names of people that ring.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So, but we're
Yeah.
monitoring that to see if our calls have gone up this year, and not the names of the 8, but how many calls came from the 8,
Mm.
and did they need more assistance through the program?
Yeah, and what did that look like, and whether you need
Yeah,
to kind of reshape some
yeah,
of the
yeah.
offer? Because for me,
Interesting.
this comes down to sort of this is about reasonable adjustments for people, isn't it? You talked about um, you know, some staff finding it slightly difficult about being very flexible and allowing people to work on, you know, work different hours to suit their own recovery pathways. And for me, I hear that in an employment context, is that's reasonable adjustments.
Yeah, and I think so we've got an example, I think, in terms of the mental health, where we've employed somebody with a very serious forensic history,
Mm-hmm.
spent 15 years in a mental health hospital,
Yeah,
is out on license, and actually us employing that person, is it a risk to us? Well, of course it is a risk to us if that person is ever in the same position again that would um, endanger someone's life.
yeah,
Then that
yeah,
we're
yeah,
in. But actually, if we can't employ them, who can?
yeah, yeah.
If we
So
can't
this is
find a
about,
way to join up
yes,
with the team and come up with a risk management system that enables the best possible flags and bells and whistles, then who can do it if we can't? It's
yeah,
the question we've had to ask
yeah,
ourselves.
yeah. No, I think that's really, really interesting. You talked about I was interested in that gap between where you've been out of a labour market, or perhaps never even in a labour market, and there is an etiquette in work, isn't there? That you learn through being in work. You know, just that stuff about starting a new job, and you know that feeling we all have where we think, do I know where the toilet is, and what's the deal on tea and coffee? Do you just help yourself, or do I
Yeah,
have to, you know, it's all those little things. And you know, we kind of know going into new jobs that that's the kind of stuff we're going to be facing. But if you've not had that experience, so that kind of learning, I was really interested in hearing those examples around people feeling they couldn't participate in those office discussions about holidays and stuff, and how I don't know how we manage that sensitively really in a workplace. Is that about talking to staff, or does that breach, you know, and saying we need to
Oh, no.
think about how inclusive we are as an organisation, and, you know, not wanting to control every element of office conversation. But I suppose, is there anything you particularly learned from that, do you think, or is it just it evolves around people?
It certainly has helped having a number of peer mentors in the same service, because they have an identity themselves. They've been on the
Yes,
training, they
yes,
know each other. So that
yeah,
one person isn't starting in a team of 8 and they're the only one. So
yeah,
that has certainly helped. But of course, in the research, there were people that were working on their own. That example of that guy who'd been in prison a lot.
yeah,
What he said he said, I can't cope in this environment because I've got nothing to contribute. But we've had to say to him, actually, if you were a 20-year-old and this was your first job, nor would they. And that's
yeah,
sort of where you are in terms of your work
yes,
profile.
yes,
And
work
that's all right.
development, yeah, yeah,
It's all right to be there. People, this is a natural process
yeah,
that some other people would have been going through, yeah, earlier on for them, but you're doing it now. You
mm,
will be able to
mm,
bring a different level of experience and contribution to some debates later on, when those debates veer off to, oh, I had this difficult client to deal with. And then you come into your own about, oh, well,
yeah.
maybe
You
they were,
store up that
maybe,
experience.
yes.
Yeah,
So, you know, it's different experiences, different conversations, I
yeah,
think.
that's
And just
incredibly
get, yeah,
powerful.
yeah, it is, isn't it? Just
Mm.
allowing people to focus on the fact that they're new and it's all right to be new.
Yeah, yeah, and just that accepting of that. I suppose that leads me to my next question, and I'm just keeping an eye on questions, and I'm not seeing any coming through, so I'm just ploughing away with the list that I've generated and trying to read my own writing. Can you say more about the confidence and self-esteem issues, which I think links to what we've just talked about? But you know, as you were talking, I was thinking, is this being properly picked up by recovery colleges then? You know, or are recovery colleges churning out confidence and self-esteem stuff that really isn't getting to, you know, to meet the needs of people, who, you know, if what we as adults in our society generally aspire to, which is to have a kind of valid role in, you know, doing something, be that employment, training, or whatever, are we missing something in our confidence and self-esteem building? Is it about we're not building on people's assets strongly enough? We're not helping people see the skills, gifts, and talents they've got, or is it about just the culture of the workplace is a bit alien if you've been out of it?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, really. I think to get to a point where they've been employed, they've clearly got something that is driving them. So they've got some to get the job, and that confidence that comes with, you know, being successful and then having to start. They've gone in with a level of self-assurance and self-esteem that actually, if we don't capture that in the moment, if we immediately start to chip away at that, it's a very fragile thing for them.
Yeah,
And again, it because they're in a new environment, it the fragility of it. And one of the things we thought about during this process, and we've certainly did during the recruitment process, we looked at our job descriptions and decided to think about percentaging the tasks out. So you might have 20 tasks on a job description. But
yeah,
actually, for some people, everybody in life, they look at that and they think, oh, I can do 16 of those really well.
yeah,
Those two I'm going to struggle with, but I could get a grip of it with a bit of training. And those two I really hate, and I hope I don't have to do those much. If you start that job and those four at the bottom are 70% of what you're going to do, you're going to struggle.
yeah,
And so what we had to do was, I think, look at the job roles and begin to say to people, this is 80% of your job here. You'll be doing a lot of this. If there's a lot of IT and you're not very IT focused, and that's a lot of putting notes on a system that you've got a bit of an IT phobia, then, you know, if that's high, but they think it's going to be low, then it just gives people that chance to think, do I do something about that now and come back to employment? Because
yeah,
if we don't get those things right, it does affect people's self-esteem when we identify it later.
yeah. Yeah.
because they know probably what they're not going to be good at, but they don't tell you, do they?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like anybody going for a
Absolutely.
job.
Absolutely. I've got an eye on the time and I can see it's not a question, but it's a comment. And one of our audience members, Leslie, has just sent a comment saying, thanks very much. I've really appreciated the presentation. And I think I'd like to say a huge thank you, Steve. I think this has been incredibly interesting. I'm really keen to know as things progress, you know, your first cohort of 6 months in,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
how this grows and develops. So it's something I think the association will be really keen to stay close to and hear more about as things develop. So on behalf of everybody, can I thank you for your time today?
Thanks a lot.
I'll share the recording so everybody will get that, you'll be able to see the screen and see the slides and hopefully hear well enough to share this with colleagues. So on behalf of the Association for Mental Health Providers, thank you very much, Stephen,
Thank
for a
you to
fantastic
everyone.
webinar. Well done. I know it's your first, so it's
Thank
always
you.
always a strange thing. And have a great day, everybody. Thanks
Thank
very much.
you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.